Welcome back, my dear followers. This is a new episode of the History of the American Mafia, a podcast written and brought to you by Fabio Fabiano and translated and read by me, Grace Carlisi. I do hope you enjoy today's new episode. Today I'm going to tell you about the 5 Points Gang. So, before definitely abandoning the 1920s era of the American Mafia, I feel the obligation to complete the period of the salient episodes of which I consider the foundation of the American criminal organization known as Cosa Nostra, that is, the 5 Points Gang. I came to this conclusion following the study of the type of organization and those who compose the gang, many of which became the reference point of the modern American Mafia. Allow me to start by mentioning a few names: Paul Kelly, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Joe Torrio, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel. The 5 Points Gang became one of the most prominent street gangs in US history and changed the way gangs operated in the US. The band we are dealing with, despite having 1,200 members at its peak, didn't have a national expansion, but limited itself to operating in the city and the state of New York. 5 Points, the area the gang chose to name themselves after, is the Lower Manhattan Historic District, earning its name from a 5-pointed intersection that we know today sits within Baker Street and Moscow Street. This area in the 1800s once lied within modern-day Center Street, the Bowery, Canal Street and Park Row. Originally controlled by Irish immigrant gangs from 1870, it was invaded by the wave of Jewish, Italian and Eastern European immigrants. Immediately, the criminal gangs began to fight for control of the territory and its illegal activities. The founder of the gang was an Italian, Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, known as most as Paul Kelly. He was born on December the 23rd, 1876, in New York, to parents who had immigrated from Potenza in the region of Basilicata in Italy. He was a boxer and started out his career in the bantamweight division. Although his career in boxing was brief, it proved to be rather successful. He was a champion and defined by the press as one of the smallest boxers, but one of the fastest and most technical in his category. In 1890, he changed his name to Paul Kelly. He used his boxing earnings to open brothels and clubs. Once at the head of the 5 Points Gang, Kelly realized that to make substantial profits, it was necessary to support corrupt politicians during the elections. Voters at the polling stations in the area controlled by the gang were threatened, and so-called suggestions on whose name was to be voted was given. Ballot papers were forged and placed regularly in the ballot boxes. They sided politically in favor of the Irish Tammany Hall formation, dominant at the time in New York. Also, thanks to his gang, he managed to control criminal trafficking and, therefore, also prostitution in the southern area of Manhattan. 1903, Kelly was arrested for assault and robbery and served 9 months in prison. The 5 Points Gang was known for its brutality and engaged in constant fights against competing gangs, which often ended leaving dead bodies behind. The 5 Points Gang most historical enemy was Monk Eastman and his gang. Born in Brooklyn to a respectable Jewish family, around 1890 he settled in the Lower Manhattan and began working as a kind of security guard in suburban clubs. He soon left the profession and he too formed a criminal gang, naming it the Eastman Gang and placing himself as its leader. He soon began a feud with the 5 Points Gang. The confrontations escalated over time. On September the 17th, 1903, there was a very bad battle which lasted for several hours on Rivington Street, Manhattan. It ended with the death of 2 members and several people wounded, some amongst innocent bystanders. When the police finally took control of the situation, they arrested Eastman. Despite the restraining order, the gang leader was released after a few hours, thanks to a verdict of a judge who was politically controlled by Tammany Hall's predominant Irish political faction. After the battle, the 2 leaders were summoned by politician Tom Foley to resolve their disputes in a direct confrontation between the 2. A truce was established, which lasted a couple of months. To resolve the dispute, a boxing match was therefore established between the 2 bosses. But even this attempt ended after 2 hours in a draw. At this point, the political Tammany Hall bosses intervened and decided to support the 5 Point Gang by depriving Eastman and his gang of any legal or political aid. Due to these measures, in 1904, Eastman was arrested and taken to serve his sentence in Sing Sing prison. Lacking his leadership, his gang weakened. Eastman, released from prison in 1909, tried several times in vain to regain control of his gang. He began to live off petty theft and went in and out of jail. After the confrontation with Eastman's criminal battery, the 5 Points Gang took control of the southern part of Manhattan. Paul Kelly opened clubs with dance halls where soon the most exclusive and important New York citizens chose his premises to spend their evening. Kelly was always well-dressed, cultured, and sophisticated. He impressed many of New York's elite. He was fluent in French, Italian, and Spanish, and was an admirer of classical art and music. Over the last few years, Kelly recruited young gangsters who later became leaders of America's major criminal syndicates, such as Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano. Later, after the gang's demise, Kelly's right-hand man, Johnny Torrio, helped shape and eventually form the nationwide crime syndicate in the United States, headed by Lucky Luciano. Al Capone, from the James Street Gang of New York, after joining the 5 Points Gang, became one of the most notorious criminals in the USA. The 5 Points Gang lost its power around 1905 when it was absorbed by what is remembered as the first mafia family in America, the one led by Giuseppe Morello. The Claw, as he was nicknamed due to the malformation of a limb, welcomed Paul Kelly in Manhattan and gave him one of his family's apartments, which came along with protection for him and his acolytes. The efficiency of the Morello family was given by the discipline of its soldiers, who had nothing to do with the members of the 5 Points Gang, instinctive, low-ranking criminals dedicated to street crimes just as robberies and thefts. Paul Kelly managed to survive a fatal ambush despite being stabbed 3 times by 2 of his lieutenants during an incident inside one of his nightclubs. Following this episode, he was put under pressure by Tammany Hall. Therefore, he kept a low profile. He was involved in nascent criminal activities such as smuggling. He died of natural causes in 1936.